I remember the exact weight of the silver cake server in my hand when I heard it, the sound of a laugh that didn't belong in my son's bedroom. It wasn't the bright, nervous giggle of his fiancée, Sarah. It was a low, melodic thrum, a sound I had known for 30 years. It was my sister-in-law, Brenda. I stood in the hallway of my own home, the house I'd lived in since Julian was a toddler, and I felt the floorboards turn to thin ice beneath my slippers. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a discovery like that. It isn't quiet at all, but rather a roaring in your ears that drowns out the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I am 71 years old. I have buried a husband, raised a son, and navigated the complexities of a large, opinionated family with what I always thought was a keen eye. I pride myself on being the glue. The one who remembers birthdays, the one who knows which tea heals a broken heart, the one who keeps the peace. But as I stood there, clutching that heavy silver antique, I realized I had been blind to the rot growing in the very center of my world. Julian was supposed to be getting married in 3 weeks. The guest list was finalized, the florist was paid, and the white tent was already reserved for the garden. Everything was curated for a perfect beginning. Yet through the sliver of the door left ajar, I didn't hear wedding preparations. I heard the intimate, hushed murmurs of a man lost in a haze, and the sharp, triumphant whispers of a woman who had spent her life pretending to be my best friend while she was busy dismantling my son's future. I didn't burst in, I didn't scream. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I simply turned around and walked back down the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. I went into the kitchen, placed the cake server on the counter, and watched my hands shake until they turned white. I'm so glad you found your way here today. Take a moment to settle in, perhaps with a warm cup of tea or a quiet space where you can simply listen. These stories are a way for us to connect woman to woman, soul to soul, through the things we often keep hidden. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. It's a comfort to imagine this circle of voices stretching across the miles. Let's sit together for a while. Life in the months leading up to the wedding had a frantic, beautiful rhythm to it. My garden was in full bloom, the hydrangeas heavy with blue clusters, and the lavender scenting the air every time a breeze rolled off the porch. I spent my mornings deadheading the roses and my afternoons at the dining room table, buried under swatches of lace and seating charts. Julian is my only child. After my husband, Arthur, passed away 8 years ago, Julian became the anchor of my world. He's a good man, kind, perhaps a bit too trusting, with his father's eyes and a way of whistling when he's deep in thought. When he brought Sarah home, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. She was steady. She loved him for his quietness, not in spite of it. Brenda, my sister-in-law, had been my shadow through it all. Married to Arthur's younger brother, she was the person I called when the house felt too empty. She was 65, sharp-witted, and always impeccably dressed in linens and pearls. "Elinor, darling," she'd say, pouring us both a glass of chilled white wine, "we are the matriarchs now. It's our job to make sure this wedding is the event of the decade." She volunteered for everything. She offered to help Julian with the logistics, the rentals, the music, the things Sarah was too busy to handle with her residency at the hospital. I thanked God for her. I told everyone how lucky I was to have a sister-in-law who stepped up when the weight of planning felt too heavy for a widow's shoulders. We spent hours in this very kitchen, laughing over guest lists and tasting samples of lemon curd and vanilla bean sponge. Brenda was Auntie Brenda to Julian, the fun aunt, the one who bought him his first car and helped him move into his first apartment. There was no reason to doubt her. There was no reason to look twice when she and Julian would disappear into the study to go over the budget. I remember one Tuesday afternoon, the sun was hitting the floor in long, golden slats. Brenda was leaning over a spreadsheet, her hand resting briefly on Julian's shoulder as he laughed at something on his phone. It looked like family. It looked like support. I stood at the sink, washing the lunch dishes, feeling a deep, contented glow. I thought we were building a foundation for his new life. I didn't know she was actually digging the grave for his reputation. I had spent decades trusting the people in my inner circle. At my age, you expect the surprises to be health scares or sudden storms, not the realization that the woman who held your hand at your husband's funeral was currently weaving a web around your son. The shift was so subtle that I initially blamed my own aging mind. I thought perhaps I was becoming cynical, or that the stress of the wedding was making me see shadows where there were only reflections. It started with the phone calls. Brenda had always been a talker, but suddenly she became a ghost. We'd be sitting on the patio, the heat of the afternoon settling around us, and her phone would buzz. She wouldn't answer it in front of me anymore. She'd offer a tight, practiced smile, murmur something about the caterer being difficult, and walk to the far end of the garden, her voice dropping into a low, rhythmic murmur. Then there was the smell. Brenda has worn the same perfume for 20 years, a heavy, sophisticated sandalwood. One evening, after Julian had stopped by to drop off some samples for the rehearsal dinner menus, I hugged him goodbye at the door. As he pulled away, that scent lingered on his wool blazer. It wasn't the light, floral perfume Sarah wore, it was Brenda's sandalwood. "Is your Aunt Brenda still helping you with the seating chart?" I asked, my voice steady despite the sudden chill in my chest. "Yeah, Ma," Julian said, not meeting my eyes as he adjusted his keys. "She's been a lifesaver. We were working late at his office last night. You know how she is, a perfectionist." I watched him walk to his car, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. My Julian, who used to tell me everything, was wearing a mask. The most unsettling clue, however, happened on a rainy Thursday. I had gone over to Brenda's house unannounced to drop off a box of old family photos she wanted to scan for the reception slideshow. Her car was in the driveway, but she didn't answer the door. I used the spare key she'd given me years ago, thinking she might be in the shower or out in the greenhouse. The house was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. I walked toward the kitchen, and there on the island was Julian's leather briefcase. Beside it sat Brenda's reading glasses and two half-empty wine glasses. A man's tie, Julian's favorite silk tie, the one I bought him for his promotion, was draped over the back of a chair. I stood there in the center of her pristine kitchen, the box of photos feeling like a lead weight in my arms. My intuition, that quiet voice I had spent 70 years cultivating, wasn't just whispering anymore, it was screaming. Why is he here during work hours? Why is his tie off? Why is she silent? I left the photos, locked the door, and drove home in a trance. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. But as the sun went down that night, I sat in the dark of my living room, realizing that the person I trusted most and the person I loved most were sharing a secret that didn't include me, or the girl Julian was supposed to marry in 2 weeks. The truth didn't come in a dramatic explosion. It arrived in the cold, clinical glow of a forgotten tablet. It was the following Monday. Brenda had left her iPad on my coffee table after we'd spent a grueling afternoon arguing with the florist over peonies. She'd stepped out to take one of her business calls, leaving the device face up. It chimed a soft, innocuous ping. I shouldn't have looked. I am a woman who believes in privacy, in the sanctity of one's own thoughts. But the name that flashed on the screen was Julian, and the preview of the message was a punch to the gut. "I can't stop thinking about yesterday. Are you home?" My fingers moved before my brain could protest. I picked up the tablet. There was no passcode. Brenda was always arrogant enough to think no one would dare look at her things. I opened the message thread, and the world as I knew it collapsed. It was a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight into a nightmare. Months of messages. It had started as mentoring, Brenda advising Julian on his career, his anxieties about the wedding, his fears of becoming a husband. But it had curdled into something unrecognizable. There were photos. Not the kind a nephew sends an aunt. There were messages from Brenda telling him that Sarah was too young to understand him, that only she, Brenda, truly knew the man he had become. And then I saw it, the most recent exchange from that afternoon in her kitchen. Your mother almost caught us with the photos. We need to be more careful until after the wedding. Once you're married, it'll be easier to hide in plain sight. I felt a physical sickness rise in my throat. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a calculated, predatory conquest. Brenda wasn't just helping with the wedding, she was curating a front so she could keep my son in her orbit. And Julian, my sweet, sensible Julian, he was responding with a desperation that broke my heart. He was a man drowning and he was clinging to a shark. I heard the back door creak open. Brenda was coming back in, her face bright with that false, polished cheer. "Everything's settled with the lilies, Elle," she said, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "Now where did I put my—" She stopped. She saw me standing there, the tablet in my hand, my face surely as white as the lilies she'd just ordered. For a second, just a second, the mask slipped. Her eyes went cold, not guilty, but calculating. "Eleanor," she said, her voice dropping that melodic lilt, "you really shouldn't have looked at that." "He is my son, Brenda," I whispered. My voice was thin, trembling like a dry leaf. "He is your nephew, how could you?" She didn't apologize, she didn't cry. She simply walked over, took the device from my hand, and looked at me with a chilling sort of pity. "Julian is a grown man, Eleanor. He makes his own choices. And right now, he chooses me. If you say a word, you'll lose him. Is that what you want, to be the woman who destroyed her son's wedding and his reputation?" She walked out then, leaving the scent of sandalwood hanging in the air like a poisonous fog. I sank onto the sofa, the silence of the house suddenly deafening. I had the proof, but Brenda was right about one thing: the truth would destroy everything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Arthur's old leather wingback chair, watching the shadows of the oak trees stretch across the carpet like skeletal fingers. Brenda's threat echoed in my mind: if you say a word, you'll lose him. She thought she knew me. She thought that because I am a woman of a certain age, a woman who avoids conflict and prizes decorum, I would crumble under the weight of a potential scandal. She thought my love for Julian was a weakness she could exploit to keep me silent. But she forgot one thing: a mother's love isn't just a soft, nurturing thing. It is also a protective, fierce fire. If I let this wedding happen, I wasn't keeping the peace. I was sentencing my son to a life of deception and Sarah, poor, innocent Sarah, to a marriage built on a foundation of ash. I began my work at 3 a.m. I didn't scream and I didn't call Julian. Instead, I went to my computer. I remembered that Brenda used a shared family cloud account for the wedding photos. My password still worked. I spent hours documenting, not for the sake of gossip, but for the sake of the truth. I saved the timestamps of their meetings that coincided with when Julian told Sarah he was at the office. I recorded the digital trail of a betrayal that had been meticulously planned. The next day was the rehearsal dinner. I dressed with more care than I ever had in my life. I wore a navy silk suit, stiff, formal, and commanding. I did my hair, applied my lipstick, and looked at the woman in the mirror. I didn't see a victim, I saw a sentry. The dinner was held at a private room in a quiet, upscale restaurant. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive wine and the forced gaiety of two families merging. Brenda was there, of course, looking radiant in a champagne-colored dress, acting the part of the doting aunt. She even had the audacity to wink at me across the table, a silent reminder of our secret. Julian looked pale. He was laughing too loud, drinking his bourbon too fast. He looked like a man who was terrified of his own shadow. Toward the end of the meal, before the toasts began, I stood up. I didn't tap a glass. I simply walked over to Julian and Brenda and whispered, "The three of us need to step into the library." "Now, Ma, not now," Julian muttered, his eyes darting to Sarah, who was laughing with her bridesmaids. "Now, Julian," I said, my voice like iron. "Unless you'd prefer I speak here, in front of Sarah's father." Brenda's smile faltered. She saw the look in my eyes, the look of a woman who had nothing left to lose because her world had already been set on fire. She followed us, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, the predator finally realizing the cage door had swung shut. The library was a small, wood-paneled room that smelled of old paper and leather. As soon as the door clicked shut, the air felt too thin to breathe. Julian leaned against a bookshelf, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, while Brenda crossed her arms, trying to reclaim her posture of superiority. Eleanor, you're making a scene, Brenda hissed, her voice a sharp whisper. Think about Sarah, think about the guests out there. I am thinking about Sarah, I said, pulling my phone from my clutch, which is why this wedding is over. And I'm thinking about my son, who seems to have forgotten who he is. I didn't give them a chance to spin a lie. I played the recording I had made, not of their intimacy, but of the conversation Brenda and I had held in my kitchen. Her own voice filled the small room, cold and calculating, admitting that she intended to hide the affair in plain sight after the wedding. Julian's breath hitched. He looked at Brenda as if seeing her for the first time without the glamour she'd cast over him. You said, he stammered, looking at her, you said you loved me. You said this was the only way we could be together. I told you she'd try to ruin it, Julian, Brenda snapped, her composure finally cracking. She's a jealous, lonely woman who can't stand to see you happy. I walked over to my son. I didn't slap him. I didn't yell. I simply held his gaze until he looked away in shame. She doesn't love you, Julian. A woman who loves you doesn't help you destroy your life. She's using you to feel young, and she's using me to feel powerful. Look at what you're about to do to Sarah. Is that the man your father raised? The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, we could hear the muffled sound of a toast and a round of applause. The juxtaposition was nauseating. I'm going out there, I said. I am going to tell Sarah and her parents that there has been a personal family crisis and that the wedding is canceled. I will not tell them the details, not yet, to spare what little dignity you have left. But you, I looked at Brenda, will leave through the back exit. You will never speak to my son again. If you do, these recordings and every message I found will be sent to your husband and the entire family, every single one. Brenda looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, but for the first time, she had no move left to make. She grabbed her wrap and vanished through the side door without a word. Julian slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He started to sob, not the quiet weeping of a man in grief, but the jagged, ugly sounds of a man realizing he had traded his soul for a shadow. I stood by the door, my heart breaking for the boy I had raised, even as the woman I had become prepared to face the wreckage in the other room. Walking back into that dining room was the hardest thing I've ever done. I had to stand before Sarah, beautiful, radiant Sarah in her white lace dress, and watch the light go out of her eyes. I didn't tell the whole truth that night. I told her that Julian was not the man she thought he was, and that I could not, in good conscience, let her walk down that aisle. It was a mercy that felt like a murder. The months that followed were quiet. The wedding of the decade became the scandal of the season, whispered about in grocery store aisles and over bridge tables. Brenda's husband eventually learned the truth, not from me, but from the cracks that started to show when she could no longer keep her stories straight. They moved away, a silent departure that left a scar on the family tree that may never fully heal. Julian moved back into his old room for a while. It wasn't the homecoming I had ever envisioned. There were weeks of silence, of him sitting on the porch staring at the horizon and me sitting in the kitchen, wondering if I had saved him or lost him forever. We started therapy together. It was painful, raw, ugly, and honest. He had to face the fact that he had been groomed by a woman he trusted, and I had to face the fact that I had been so focused on the perfect family image that I missed the cries for help from my own son. But slowly, the frost began to melt. One evening, as the first leaves of autumn began to drift onto the lawn, Julian came into the kitchen while I was peeling apples for a pie. He took the knife from my hand and started to help, just like he did when he was 10 years old. "I'm sorry, Ma," he whispered, his voice thick. "I thought I was special. I thought she saw something in me no one else did." I didn't realize she was just taking everything from me. We all want to feel seen, Julian, I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. But real love builds you up. It doesn't ask you to hide in the dark. He's not cured. He still carries the weight of what he did to Sarah, a debt he may never be able to repay. But he is present, he is loyal, and for the first time in a long time, he is honest. Our bond is different now. It's not built on the easy assumptions of the past, but oh. The garden is quiet now. The white tent was never put up, and the roses I tended so carefully have dropped their petals for the season. My house feels larger, emptier, and yet somehow lighter. I've learned that being the glue of a family isn't about holding together a lie so it looks like a truth. It's about having the courage to let things break when they are no longer honest. It's a lonely path sometimes, choosing integrity over the appearance of peace, but it's the only path that leads to a life worth living. I often sit on my porch as the sun sets, thinking about Brenda and Julian and the fragility of trust. I wonder how many of us are holding onto things that are already broken, simply because we're afraid of the sound they'll make when they hit the floor. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer out loud, just think on it. Have you ever had to choose between a painful truth and a comfortable lie, and looking back, was the peace you found on the other side worth the storm it took to get there? Thank you for spending this time with me. It means more than you know.